The West was built on dust, hunger, and pride, and no place showed that truth more clearly than the town of Dry Creek. It wasn't much more than a narrow strip of dirt with buildings lined shoulder to shoulder. Their wooden planks cracked by the sun, their windows streaked with sand carried by the endless wind. And yet, for all its dust and ruin, Dry Creek carried itself like a place that mattered. Men swaggered along the boardwalks, women crossed the street with their heads held high, and children darted between wagons, their laughter thin and sharp against the silence of the desert. But beneath it all was hunger. It lived in the eyes of the poor, in the hollowed cheeks of widows, in the way some folks lingered too long near the smell of bread baking inside Jenkins' general store. Hunger was a shadow in Dry Creek, and that shadow followed her every step. She was not new to humiliation. Her dress, once pale blue, had been mended so many times it was little more than a quilt of faded fabric. Her shoes were worn through at the soles, and the dust seemed to claim her before she even stepped off the street. But her back was straight, her chin lifted, because dignity was the last coin she had left to spend. Her boy clung to her skirt. He couldn't have been more than 7, with hair tangled by wind and eyes too large for his thin face. The kind of boy who had learned too early to silence his stomach growls, who had stopped asking for what his mother could not give. When she pushed open the door to Jenkins's general store, a bell rang overhead, sharp, accusing. Inside, the air smelled of flour, coffee, and something sweet cooling on the counter. Shelves rose high, stacked with beans, canned peaches, jars of molasses. There was more food in that room than her boy had seen in months. His eyes lit up, and he tugged her hand, whispering, "Mama, look." But her eyes were fixed on the counter, where Mr. Jenkins stood. A large man with a red face and a belly that strained against his vest. Jenkins prided himself on running a store where debts weren't tolerated and sympathy was scarce. She placed her few coins on the counter, her hand trembling only slightly. "Please, a loaf of bread." Jenkins glanced at the coins, then at her. His mustache twitched as he shook his head. "Not enough." Her throat tightened. She pushed one coin forward, desperate. "Half a loaf, then. Anything." The man's face hardened. His voice was louder this time, meant for the others in the store to hear. "We don't cut loaves here. If you can't pay, you don't eat." The words cracked through the air like a whip. The few customers froze where they stood. A ranch hand near the barrels of nails, a woman picking out thread, an old man examining sacks of oats. They all heard, but none spoke. Her boy's small voice broke the silence. "Mom, I'm hungry." Her cheeks flushed red. She pressed her hand against his hair, shushing him, but the damage was done. Jenkins scowled as if the child's hunger was an insult. He scooped up the coins, shoved them back into her hand, and marched toward the door. "Come back when you've got real money," he said. And with one final shove, he opened the door wide, forcing her and her boy into the glare of the sun. The bell above the door rang once more, cruel in its cheer. She stood on the steps, coins biting into her palm, the boy hiding his face against her skirt. Her pride screamed at her to keep standing, to hold her head high. But her stomach ached, her son whimpered, and the weight of 100 watching eyes crushed her spirit. Still, she walked. Step by step, she pulled her boy away from the store, away from the bread that had been denied them. Across the street, on the porch of the saloon, a cowboy watched. He was a man of dust himself, with boots that had walked too many miles and eyes that carried shadows of their own. He leaned against the post, hat tilted low, cigarette burning slow between his fingers. He wasn't the kind of man to care for other people's troubles. The West had taught him that survival belonged to those who kept to themselves. But something about the woman, the way she straightened her back after being broken in front of everyone, the way she shielded her boy from shame even as her own pride bled out, struck something deep in him. He dropped his cigarette into the dirt, ground it beneath his boot, and began to follow. The street carried on around them. A wagon rattled by, horses stamping in the heat. A drunk stumbled from the saloon, laughing too loudly. The town resumed its rhythm, forgetting the scene at the store door as quickly as it had begun. But for her, and for the man who followed, nothing would be the same again. The sun was beginning its slow descent when she finally reached the edge of town. The dirt road stretched before her, pale and endless, lined with scrub and the occasional skeletal tree that clawed at the sky. Her boy's small hand gripped hers tightly, fingers trembling, nails dirty with the dust of the day. Hunger pulled at them both like an invisible weight, yet neither stopped. They could not stop, not when the world had made it so clear they were unwanted. A shadow fell across the path, long and deliberate. She glanced up and saw him, the cowboy from the saloon porch. His hat was tilted low over his eyes, and his boots pressed into the dirt with a quiet authority. For a moment she froze, unsure if she should flee, if she could run from the strange mixture of danger and kindness in his stance. "You," he began, his voice low and rough, a whisper carried by the wind. "You don't need to walk alone." Her heart skipped. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. She looked down, shaking her head, uncertain. I can manage." "You can manage a child on an empty stomach?" His tone wasn't a question, it was an observation, a truth she could not argue. She swallowed, cheeks burning, pride warring with desperation. "We'll be fine," she whispered. The cowboy took a step closer. His eyes softened as he studied her, studied the boy, and the quiet desperation clinging to them like dust on worn clothing. "Come with me," he said. And then, with a calm certainty that brooked no argument, he added, "I'll fill your table tonight." The boy's eyes widened, and he let out a small gasp. He tugged at his mother's skirt. "Mama," her lips pressed together. She wanted to refuse, to cling to the small shred of independence she had left, but the truth was undeniable. They could not survive another night like this. She nodded, barely perceptible, and the cowboy offered her his hand. The journey began in silence. The three of them moved along the winding road that led out of Dry Creek, away from the noise of judgmental eyes, away from the town that had refused them sustenance and kindness. The wind carried the smell of sagebrush, dry and sharp, and the sky above them deepened to a soft, bruised purple as dusk approached. Her mind wandered, conflicted. Who was this man? Why would he care? In a world that had shown her nothing but rejection, his presence was almost too surreal to grasp. And yet, with each step, his calm certainty grounded her, offering a fragile thread of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. The cowboy walked beside them, his pace measured, protective. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer pity. He simply led, and in that act, he gave them both something they hadn't known they were missing: security. By the time they reached the small rise that overlooked a solitary cabin, the first stars were beginning to pierce the twilight. The cabin was modest, weathered by years of sun and wind, smoke curling from its chimney. Inside it was humble, yet it promised warmth, a table and food. The woman's heart tightened. She wanted to thank him, to say the words, but pride and disbelief tangled her tongue. The cowboy, sensing her hesitation, nodded toward the door. "It's not much," he said, "but it'll be enough for tonight." "And that's what matters." She glanced at her boy. His eyes were wide with cautious hope, the first flicker of trust since they had been turned away at the store. She held her son close, drew in a shaky breath, and stepped forward. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and wood, of dust that had settled over years, of something unspoken yet safe. The cowboy moved to a small cabinet, pulling out bread, a bit of dried meat, and some beans he had set aside for himself. He placed the food before them simply, without ceremony. Yet to the woman and her boy it was a feast beyond imagining. The child's stomach had long forgotten the sensation of fullness, and now he smiled, shyly, timidly, as he took the bread. The woman's hands trembled as she helped him, feeling a mixture of relief, disbelief, and gratitude she could hardly name. Her eyes met the cowboy's, and for a moment, no words were needed. His quiet strength and the simple generosity of his act spoke louder than anything could. Outside, the stars glimmered cold and distant. Yet inside that cabin, for the first time in a long while, warmth filled the air. It was more than food. It was a promise, a fleeting, fragile promise, but a promise nonetheless. That even in a world that had turned them away, There were still people willing to offer a hand. And that night, as the boy slept with a full belly and the woman watched him softly, the cowboy remained by the fire, a silent guardian in a land that had shown them little mercy. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry earth. The woman stirred, careful not to wake her boy, whose small chest rose and fell in peaceful sleep for the first time in days. Outside, the cowboy was already preparing for the journey ahead. His horse, a lean chestnut with scars that spoke of battles past, stamped impatiently in the dirt, sensing the quiet urgency of the day. He turned when he saw her watching him. "We need to move," he said softly, not as a command, but as a simple truth. "There's more than this town waiting to judge us, and less than a full belly to keep us alive if we linger." She nodded, gathering her few belongings. The boy clutched a small, worn doll, his eyes still heavy with sleep but brightening when he saw the horse. Pride and fear warred in her chest. Could she trust this man? Could they leave behind the town that had spat them out so easily, following someone they barely knew? The cowboy helped her onto the saddle behind him, then lifted the boy onto the front. The child's small hands clung to the leather, and for a moment she held her breath, afraid he might slip, afraid the world itself might collapse beneath them. The ride began slowly. Dust kicked up behind them in a soft cloud that shimmered in the early light. The wind whipped against their faces, carrying the scent of sagebrush, sun-baked earth, and the faint, comforting odor of the cowboy's horse. With every step, the town of Dry Creek receded, shrinking into the background as a place of judgment and hunger, replaced by open roads and the vast, unbroken expanse of the west. They rode in silence, but the air between them was heavy with unspoken words. The woman's mind raced, tracing the events of the past weeks, the loss of her husband to fever, the relentless grind of survival, the hunger in her child's eyes, and the shame of rejection at the store. All of it pressed down on her like the sun overhead. And yet, with the cowboy beside her, a sliver of hope began to pierce through. He didn't ask questions, and she offered none. Words would have seemed intrusive or perhaps unnecessary. Instead, the rhythm of the horse, the clink of stirrups against leather, and the soft whisper of wind through the scrub became their shared language. Every now and then the cowboy's hand would brush against hers, a grounding touch that reminded her they were not alone. The boy, initially tense, began to relax. He leaned into her back, muttering softly when he saw something in the distance, a hawk circling overhead, a rabbit darting through the scrub. Each small joy became magnified in the vast emptiness of the west, each smile a rebellion against the hunger and fear that had defined their days. Hours passed, though time felt different here, stretched across the endless horizon. The sun rose higher, then tilted westward, painting the sky in bruised oranges and purples. At the top of a small ridge, the cowboy finally paused, letting the horses breathe. Before them lay a small cabin tucked into a bend of trees, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. It was humble, weathered, and scarred, but it was home. He guided them down the slope, his movements sure and calm. "We'll rest here for tonight," he said simply. "It's enough." Inside, the cabin smelled of firewood and old leather. The woman set her boy down gently, watching as he explored the small room, eyes wide with wonder and disbelief at the simple comforts it offered. There was a small table, a few rough chairs, and a cabinet stocked with enough supplies to feed them for days. The cowboy moved to the cabinet, retrieving a small loaf of bread, some dried meat, and a tin of beans. He laid the food out simply, not as an act of generosity to be praised, but as a natural part of the life he led, one of quiet compassion in a world that seldom offered it. For the woman, the moment was almost unbearable. She knelt, arranging the food, her hands trembling with relief and disbelief. The boy tore at the bread eagerly, his laughter filling the cabin for the first time in what felt like forever. She watched him, tears pricking her eyes, and finally allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the warmth that had been denied her for so long. The cowboy remained by the fire, silent and steady. His eyes occasionally flicked toward her and the boy, observing without intrusion, understanding without words. In that quiet cabin, they were not defined by hunger, shame, or the cruelty of a town that had turned them away. Here, for the first time in months, they existed simply as a mother, a child, and a man who had chosen to intervene. And though the journey ahead would still be long, uncertain, and harsh, tonight, the table was full, the hearth warm and hope, fragile, flickering, undeniable, had returned to the little family he had rescued from the streets of Dry Creek. Night had fallen over the small cabin, wrapping the world outside in a deep, quiet darkness. The fire in the hearth crackled and hissed, sending warm, golden shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the scrub, carrying with it the scent of sage and dry earth, a lullaby both harsh and comforting. Inside, the woman sat on the floor, her boy nestled against her side, eyes heavy with sleep, but glowing faintly with contentment. The cowboy leaned back in a rough wooden chair, boots resting near the fire. His hat was tilted forward, shadowing his eyes, but his presence filled the room with calm authority. He did not speak at first, allowing the silence to settle like a soft blanket, letting the woman and child soak in the warmth of a night free from hunger. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice tentative, almost shy. I lost him, she said softly, fingers tracing patterns in the rough floorboards. My husband. He died of the fever. Just like that. She lifted her eyes, glistening with tears, and watched the flames dance. And then the farm. It wasn't mine anymore. I had nowhere to go. Nothing to give my boy, her voice cracked, but the words were steady enough to carry the weight of a story long buried. She glanced down at her son, asleep against her chest, and whispered, I thought maybe we'd starve before anyone cared. The cowboy did not respond immediately. He had lived through his own share of loss, battles that left scars on both his body and his spirit. And now, hearing her story, he recognized in her pain the same quiet loneliness he had carried for years. Finally, he spoke low and deliberate. I lost mine too. Family. They didn't make it. Took them all. I wandered for months after, thinking the world would swallow me whole. The woman looked up, startled. His words were few, but they carried a weight she understood intimately. He continued, his voice steady. You don't need to explain yourself to me. Hunger, loss, fear. I know them all. And I know what it feels like to be turned away when all you wanted was something to survive. She swallowed, a mixture of relief and astonishment tightening her throat. There was no pity in his tone, no judgment. Only acknowledgement, only understanding. The night deepened, and the wind outside rose slightly, rattling the cabin walls. They spoke in fragments, stories of hardship and survival, of things lost and battles endured. The boy stirred but did not wake fully, comforted by the warmth and security that had finally reached him. Hours seemed to stretch, filled with the unspoken bond forming between the woman and the cowboy. No one else could see it, and perhaps no one ever would. But in that cabin, the shadows on the walls carried their stories, and the fire held their truths. At one point, she reached for a piece of bread, breaking it silently. Offering a small portion to the cowboy, he shook his head, smiling faintly, and gestured to her and the boy instead. You'll need it more than I do, he said simply, and in that gesture more was said than any words could convey. He was not just a rescuer. He was a witness. A man who saw the world's cruelty and still chose to intervene. And she realized, with a mixture of awe and cautious hope, that perhaps this night could be the beginning of something they all had long thought impossible. Trust. Safety and maybe, just maybe, a semblance of family. Outside, the stars burned cold and distant, indifferent to human struggle, yet inside, in the warmth of a cabin built of timber and fire, a small miracle unfolded. The past, heavy and relentless, was acknowledged, but not allowed to dominate the present. And for the first time in a long time, the woman allowed herself to breathe fully, to rest without fear, knowing that for tonight at least, hunger and danger had been held at bay. Dawn arrived slowly, spilling pale gold across the horizon. The cabin's walls, scarred by time and weather, glowed softly in the morning light. The boy stirred first, blinking sleep from his eyes as he hugged the small loaf of bread that had been set aside for him. His mother watched, her heart full, yet uneasy. She knew the world outside the cabin was still harsh, unforgiving, but for a moment it seemed as if time itself had paused, offering them reprieve. The cowboy stood by the door, adjusting the straps of his saddlebags. He watched the woman and her son, his expression calm, unreadable, yet protective. "We need to go back to town," he said quietly. She stiffened. "Back there?" Her voice trembled. The thought of returning to the place that had humiliated her, where the eyes of strangers had pierced her like arrows, was almost unbearable. He nodded. "Yes, but not for them. For you, for him. You'll need supplies if you're to survive the next weeks, and this time they won't turn you away." The road back to Dry Creek seemed shorter than the one that had brought them here. Perhaps it was the boy's laughter, the newfound energy in his step, or the quiet reassurance of the cowboy beside them. As they approached the store, the townsfolk began to stir. Curious eyes peered from windows, from porches, from the edges of the boardwalk. They had seen the woman enter and then leave, and wondered if she would return. The cowboy dismounted first, helping the boy down gently. The woman followed, heart pounding in her chest. She felt the weight of every glance, every whispered judgment. Yet she also felt something else, the quiet strength of the man who had saved them from despair. Inside Jenkins's general store, the air smelled the same as the day before, but the atmosphere had changed. The same man with the sharp mustache looked up, his face a mask of confusion as he saw them enter together. "I'll take enough for a week," the cowboy said, placing coins on the counter. The man blinked, unsure. "I'll pay in full." "You'll sell her what she needs." The woman's hand tightened around her son's, her chest rising and falling with the mix of fear and hope. She said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The cowboy's presence, his unwavering stance, was enough to speak for them both. Jenkins hesitated, then nodded slowly, sliding sacks of flour, beans, and dried meat across the counter. The townsfolk outside paused, watching, murmuring among themselves. No one had expected him to step in, to challenge the small, cruel hierarchy of the town. But here he was, simple and unyielding, ensuring that hunger would no longer have the final word. As they left the store, the boy skipping ahead with new supplies in hand, the woman glanced at the cowboy. For the first time in many months, she smiled freely, tears prickling the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He tipped his hat, a faint smile brushing his lips. "No need," he said. "Just keep moving forward. That's all that matters." They returned to the cabin, the table now full, a symbol of hope and survival. The boy ran ahead, laughter spilling into the morning air, while the woman and the cowboy followed side by side. Outside, the world remained harsh, dust-filled and indifferent, but inside, a small miracle had taken place. A table once empty now held food, warmth, and a promise that even in a world that often turned people away, there were those who would choose kindness. And so, in the West, where life was unforgiving and every day carried the threat of loss, a mother, her child, and a solitary cowboy had found something rare: mercy, hope, and the knowledge that sometimes a single act of compassion could change a life forever.